All right. So this is going to be an interesting interview. Here I got Sam Willman. Am I
Hmm.
pronouncing that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think I just kind of, to kind of just go through some introductions, I kind of just stumbled upon your work. Um, we have a mutual friend, OG Rose. So I,
Hmm.
I think he is the couple. OG Rose is basically like my I talk to them a lot. Let's put it that way. Um, but they're always Daniel's very active in like acknowledging other people's work. So
Hmm.
occasionally, when I kind of glance around, uh, things that he is interested in piques my interest too.
Hmm.
So I stumbled upon your Substack. I think the first article I read was your article on this idea between nature and kind of like assimilating to our environment, um,
Hmm.
which I found wonderful. But just to kind of give like a nice introduction, for my channel, what is like your main, I guess, interest, corpus of your work, and like, where do you what do you want to do with it? What is it that you're trying to think through? What inspires you? Um, yeah, I think that's a good first question.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. So my background is in architecture, academically, and I work as a designer in architecture currently. So that's my day to day. And then with the Substack, I think that I believe the article that you were referring to was on the inside's necessity for an out. And I think that really gets at like my main personal curiosity. Um, I think I think that when you spend so much time trying to materialize your own intentions and design a space, you really begin to wonder like how it's designing you. And so, for me, that feedback loop in relation to um, interiority is really what I like to look at. And then you get into the fact that creating an interior, it necessitates an out, an exterior. So those two things are intimately linked. Yeah.
Okay. I also read your recent Substack, and I like the way you began it in terms of you were talking about you began thinking that architecture was taking chaos and putting it into order,
Hmm.
right? And then towards the end of the your article, basically you're saying like I don't really think that way anymore.
Hmm.
I don't want to think that way anymore. Uh,
Yeah.
you don't want to think in this kind of like opposites, um, which is kind of funny because it's actually kind of where a lot of my thought has been dwelling on.
Hmm.
Um, it's this process of we. It's hard for us humans to think opposite. We every time we think of opposites, we include negation,
Hmm.
but in reality, we need to think of opposites in like terms of movement, the way things actually move, and
Yeah.
and that's a whole different thing. So please, elaborate on how you feel about opposites and stuff.
Yeah, I think that was like a really nice and neat place for the thinking to start. Inside, outside, opposites, clear, simple, chaos, order, opposites, clear, simple. Um, but I think like Bachelard puts it really well because he, in his text, The Poetics of Space, he has a chapter on the dialectics of inside and out, where he very much feels that insides becomes outsides and then become insides, and their interchangeability, uh, it muddies things. They're almost, it's like the world's turning inside out and outside in constantly. And then also, yeah, thinkers like Alder via James Hillman, who I cited in that article, I think like, the more that you live through your ideas, and anybody who's anybody who's thinking, which is everybody, they're trying to go towards some ideal, which very much points to like your most recent article, and you're defining that for yourself, and you're trying to understand how these concepts become real. And the more that you do that, you realize that they just aren't simple, And I think for me, I began to realize that, yeah, when I polarize the world, it seems very clear on the paper, but it never works out that way. It never lives through so simply. So I think it became important to me to just like, to try and not fool myself into, not seeing the territory for the map, to really, uh, I can think of a Kierkegaard quote where he says it's better to be an enemy of the people than an enemy of reality, and I think that's a great. That's what I would rather be an enemy to the paper than to reality.
Yeah. Okay. So now this is really interesting because I do like asking this question of, now that your thinking is sort of going in this direction,
Mm-hmm.
do you bother to sort of explain these um, realizations to maybe common day people that don't necessarily associate themselves with like philosophy, or maybe even like your classmates in architecture, or just your people that you work with in architecture?
Mm-hmm.
How do you even approach this subject at all, or do you just kind of?
Yeah, I mean, so I think like on the Substack, the reason why I write that, my goal is to be able to work these ideas, to get them out, get them defined, and maybe I need to rely on a bunch of sources like I did like in my last response, because often we're thinking with others, and some often they're you know you don't know them personally.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I might start with all these sources, but I'm trying to get it out there, and I'm trying to connect it. I think associative thinking is a really important part of how I write. And I think eventually I I think I can link it to things that can make sense to anyone. I mean, people are just gonna have to go read the Substack, but I do have one article called, actually, I'm not entirely sure. It's like Diva Sanctuaries and Toilet Bowls, I think.
Okay.
And it's a lot more approachable. There's no sources, and I try to get to the crux of why atmosphere is important to architecture in a really funny, approachable way. And I think that by combining like weird little anecdotal experiences with texts, that and just to get it all in the same place together, my goal with the Substack and just with my writing is that um, I'll I'll get better at saying it in common words, and just making it you know I think the smartest people can express like $10 ideas with 5-cent words, and that's where I would like to get to, but it's a big goal. And then with like other people, maybe they're designers, or like in school, things like that. I think it's I'm a young designer, so I'm working in an office as an employee. So I don't always have access to clients, like to like because at the end of the day, like a client needs to be persuaded of an idea, right? To to have it go through. But like I think like I try my best uh, in my work to bring through the best of my thinking as a product whenever I can. And, whether I need to lift the veil and show them all my sources, I probably won't do that. But I do try and make myself, pretty clear, pretty evident where I can.
Okay. Do you feel like with your work right now, is this Substack going to lead to something like more? Like, is it? Do you want it to like manifest in some type of like, like a book or something, to where, right now you're just sort of like working out your ideas, you're just writing them out. Um, is that something that you kind of plan on, or is it just something right now for you just to work out through? I mean, there's no wrong answer really. But, yeah.
Yeah, I think my main goal in starting that, and also with doing the Indie Thinkers cohort with Daniel of OG Rose, which is how I met him. Going through that cohort and meeting the people that I have, the goal that unfolded for me, I wasn't quite sure at first, but I think it's really to just like have a firm stance towards the profession that I've chosen. Like, I hope to be stamped soon. Like, I hope, like, as my career progresses, that I would have my own practice. And I just don't want to be fumbling, like, through what it means to design, I think I can be a bit like inhibited when I don't feel like I fully understand something. Bit of a Hamlet in that way, and so I hope I do a lot of the fumbling now while I'm young, so that when I'm older and in more of a position to really make moves, like, I can just do that with a firm conviction,
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you said something earlier about when we write ideas. Well, I do like this idea of like when we're designing something, there's something that's designing us.
Yeah.
Right. So I think when you say like, you're fumbling, I almost feel like there has to be a sort of, death in designing, which allows for continuous creation. And I'm like curious to even think about what does death by design even mean, in the prospect of continuous creation, because I honestly think that your fumbling is a good thing. And I think sometimes fumbling is necessary, where you'd always want the capacity to sort of be able to change, but not force that change, right? Like the design itself would cause your death, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think that's a nice idea, but because I know that typically I feel the same as you in other aspects of my life, where I try not to want to fumble with a certain idea. I think, like, for example, see, with yours is designing, right? For me, it's the problem of the multiplicity of religions. I'm constantly trying to work that out. And you could say the only solution, that I've found, that I've been working through, is the concept of perennialism, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but it's, in a really rough sketch, it's basically this idea of that all religions, the more ancient traditions of religions, have a common core, right? They have an underlying common core that roots from the same source. And for me, this accounts for, difference and, predispositions and so on, and languages. It accounts, in my opinion, for a lot. But the problem is that I can fall into sort of this naive universalism where I just kind of blindly say, "Oh, well, we're all the same," and I just stop thinking. And that's what I don't want to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm constantly in this tension of, I don't want a cheap universalism. I want a universalism that requires work. Um, so that's kind of like my thinking.
Hmm.
But yeah, I totally relate to your idea of like you don't want to fumble through anymore with your profession. You want to kind of be in a solid ground.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, actually, with your Substack, do you hope to turn it into a book?
I think every time that I think about making some of my stuff into a book, it just, I don't know. I find that if I make the intentions of writing a book,
Hmm.
I'm like, oh, I'm going to talk about this one concept
Yeah.
solely. It never ends up being that one concept. I think my Substack is like probably the most sporadic writings I've ever done.
Hmm.
Yet people tell me when you read through all of them, there's like this underlying theme. Uh,
Yeah.
so that's surprising to me when I hear that I have this underlying theme when I'm just sort of what I feel is writing randomly about topics. But I mean, I would like to write a book, but
Well, I think that's kind of the nice thing of writing in this format, right? Like, there is something hidden under all these sporadic ideas that I think, I mean, it's like why Plato wrote dialogues, like you don't always, you can't always, you know, you can't say everything. Sometimes you need to point to things.
hmm.
Um, yeah, and I think like I do think that fumbling actually is like really generative, right? Because you it lets you be more dynamic, if you think of a person literally fumbling like a football. Like there's a lot of sporadic movement in that you wouldn't go through if you were to just simply say, I'll drop the ball, like goal oriented action. So I think that is like a benefit to this form of writing, and also just the way that things unfold when you aren't trying to like tie them all together with a really nice neat bow.
Hmm.
And I think that kind of goes back to the idea that like um, polarized thinking is a bit it's it's just it's like a nice lie, opposites are neat, and the world often isn't. Yeah.
So this is an interesting question. I'm curious as to whether there is any theological ties to your thinking um, at all. If there's like, yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think in the process of design, well, for me personally, like I think all creative acts are essentially creation. Like I don't I don't want to, I don't want to try and own my ideas or objectify my ideas. I think there's a sentience to thinking that is transsubjective. Like, and I think people who are book nerds and who cite all of these different writers when they speak, and it's super annoying. There's a way in which you're participating with a thinking that is beyond all of those individuals. I think you need to. Well, maybe you don't need to, but I do think it's helpful to have um, respect and reverence for for the ideas themselves. Um, yeah, and with design, I think that in terms of earlier you talked about, is there a death that you need to go through? It's pretty cliche, but just like let go of your ego, like it doesn't need to be your idea, especially in architecture, because, like if you're designing a public square, it's for everyone. It's not for you. Your whims don't matter. It's, whether you like it or not, it's you need to be responsible to everybody who uses it. And you need to sort of digest what it means for a bunch of individuals, all with different desires, different likes, different preferences, to come together in that place. And yeah, but like for myself personally, like beyond just like the reception of ideas and the life of ideas themselves, I think another, like a metaphysical stance that I really think is important, just for me individually and in relation to my work, is that um, that like I don't know, like I think, well, there's a long tradition of likening architecture to language in the 20th century, and the communicative capacity of architecture has been explored as like literal, as musical. Different architectural elements have been likened to like to sort of like a semiotic of structure. It's long. It's a long history, and I think the current consensus is that no, architecture is not meant to be communicative. But for, I mean, anyone can think whatever they like, but it's in the 20th century. It's all been couched in this idea that only humans communicate, and like, I have a good respect for finer definitions of language which only belong to humans. I think that's really important. But I have a cat, and we communicate pretty well. And yeah, I think insofar as we're building spaces that we believe to be communicative in some capacities, whether we think that's in a literal, like a symbolic way, or we think of it as the transmission of different sort of like mindsets or mood states via atmosphere. I do think like there is a communication, and I think it's extremely important to broaden that beyond the anthropocentric idea of communication. And this is something that is like, it's not very well developed in my thinking how one goes about that. I think that, well, actually, like this is a great book. Eduardo Kohn, How Forests Think. And in it, he talks about the difference between like iconic communication, indexical communication, and symbolic communication, I think is the last one. But like iconic communication is just like kind of a mimesis of something. And like I think that the broader natural world can understand that just fine. I mean, he proves it. He makes a compelling argument that is the case. And I think like architecture needs to explore this. Like, to me, it feels like it's an ancient profession. We have 5,000 years or more of, well, no, go back like Tepe. So we have at least 10,000 years of this tradition of which I'm like honored to be a part. And I think we can have bigger aspirations than just like mood setting, although I do think that's important, and human communication. Like I think that, and that the outside, the broader world, that outside of our world as a human world, we should be communicating with them. And I think for the most part, we have been communicating with them up until we disensouled the world, you know? So yeah, I guess I would count that as kind of like a religious inclination towards the practice. Yeah.
That's so fascinating, because like I think there's like one book I encountered that was like this critique against architecture in the way it's not assimilating to like this oneness of nature.
Mm-hmm.
I really forgot what book it was called, because I remember at one point I was like, I'm going to read this book one day because it's so fascinating to me.
Yeah.
But I guess what really popped out when you were talking about language and architecture
Mm-hmm.
was just, just the, even the theological idea that there's logos in creation,
Yeah.
um, which is, it's fascinating. But at the same time, I was going to ask you this other question where, when we compare, and I think you kind of already did it, we compare, for example, like ancient architecture versus, the architecture of now.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's room. What I would like to see, I think, is this idea that this is just kind of me just shooting in the void here. I
Mm-hmm.
want to say that in ancient architecture, there was room for architecture that held a space for mystery,
Mm-hmm.
for enchantment. And I am curious to know, and I'm not saying if you can answer or not, but I am curious to know what that actually how that would translate into like a modern architecture. How would a modern architecture hold um, some type of space? It doesn't have to be like a physical space, but some type of space, some type of way of containing mystery, um, which I do feel like the ancient architecture did have, um, or we could say mystery as reverence, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts would be for that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and listening to it, I feel like technically it's kind of self-contradictory. Like,
Yeah.
I think that modernity seeks to erase mystery. So
Mm-hmm.
how could a modern architecture contain it? I think it's like, actually, I think that when we had walled cities, we let the polis live in a very defined space. And the polis is relatively without mystery, at least for a human being. But outside of the polis, it was it was there was it was literally a space for everything else, you know?
Mm.
And it was clearly defined, that boundary was known and seen. And now we have cities where they just spill out like cracked eggs, you know? And they don't really end, you know? You
Yeah.
drive out of a city and it's just like still kind of spewing out, you know, like there's no event character to leaving a city anymore. And in that way, we don't really leave cities. You know, we don't think that the mindset of the polis, it doesn't end somewhere spatially. So yeah, I think it's a little hard to do that. I mean, architecture is participating with like a whole culture when it builds. So you would really need people first to like believe that that there's something else, and it's in that way that I feel really interested by interiority in the way that it designs us, because I think that the city, an ancient Grecian city, is a great example. Like the inside outside boundary, it becomes a part of the way that we live, and then it designs society. you didn't bury your dead inside the city walls. There was many ways that lives were lived out in relation to that boundary, that built space. And I mean, it was built physically, but also it was built ritually. Like ancient Grecian cities were first ritually augured, and they're, like it was kind of a magical process in building, like prior in ancient history, even in medieval history. You first had to like transcribe the order of the heavens, in onto the earth in order to get a nice plumb, square, or rectangular foundation, and from there you could build up. But especially if you were trying to build something that was in some way oriented, like an east facing basilica or something.
Mm-hmm. I do like this idea of even going back, to like ritualistic architecture.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a beautiful idea, but you're right. It is kind of contradicting towards what we're doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess, I mean, yeah, I think you kind of answered it, but it's like, I guess the hard part is thinking like, if mystery is impossible in architecture now, where can we find, mystery again?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there another way to sort of reintegrate mystery within design again?
Well, I mean, not everything is built like it is in the West, and not everybody thinks like we think in the West. I'm trying to think of. I'm gonna feel terrible if I say this incorrectly, but Tamaki Uno, he's a Japanese architect. And he builds things like with huge, with like massive stones and massive wood beams with no nails. It's a completely different process. I mean, it's also a different context, so you can do those kind of things. It's a different value system, ultimately.
Mm.
You just couldn't convince people to. It's actually very hard to convince people that something matters beyond how it looks. Like
Mm-hmm.
often, people say, "Oh, I love wood beams. Like, let's get some wood beams in here." And the engineer will say, "No, we actually don't need those." So you'll kind of build it out with just like a hollow box. And it looks like a wood beam. It looks like the thing they want, but it isn't. And I feel like we are secretly to ourselves so much more sensual than we know. Spaces that aren't built with solid, heavy timbers don't sound like the same, as when they're built with like hollow, framed out boxes. And yeah, and it says something. I think it says something different. This is purely wild hippie speculation, but like I feel like the ground on which that building sits feels that it's not as heavy. Like in the mode of like speaking to the broader world when you build something. Even if you can't tell the difference in the ways that it looks, it's not the same thing, I just feel like it does. It's hard to convince people that you would want to use the more expensive heavy timber because it's a different value system, and
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, it reminds me. I mean, I think it's probably because it's built on the concept of exchange and the concept of exploitation
Mm-hmm.
that we sort of lose, it kind of sounds ridiculous to be like, why would you use the more expensive wood?
Mm-hmm.
But I think you've been getting at some points that I want to comment on, where you're talking about, it's more than it looks, and then there's something more than this sort of mood element, the mood that it brings, which I think it's this world being caught up in a duality that is really, perhaps more triune, like, there's the physical, there's the psyche, and then there's the spiritual. And I think that aspect of the spiritual, like spiritual architecture embodied, is something that perhaps, I mean, I don't know what that would look like. I can only guess because, for example, like when I go in like an ancient Catholic church, there's some type of like overwhelming feeling that you get, and it's so beautiful. Like you don't have words to express this.
Totally.
But I don't get that same awe, that same, feeling if I were to go to like another building.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think there is this like, and I really do think that the pushing of this spiritual aspect is so important, because
Mm-hmm.
you can tell where the dependency between physical and psyche start falling apart. And people think there must be some type of reconciliation between psyche and physical, but the problem is there is no reconciliation between psyche and physical. What you're missing is the spiritual. The spiritual is the part that is sort of unnoticed, unacknowledged in this element. So yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I very much agree. Like, I think sometimes when you talked about going into an old church and the way that it makes you feel, like, I remember the first time I went to Basilica San Clemente in Rome, oldest church in Rome, I believe. Not that particular iteration of it, but in the foundations, there's like two churches underneath it. But yeah, I was there, and it was just like every surface was so cared for, you know. Like, I just felt like every piece of marble in that floor must have felt like so revered, so cared for, so celebrated, and it's like, okay, you have like the physical, the kind of the shallowly physical idea is, wow, it's visually stunning.
Mm-hmm.
I think, like it's complex, it is, orderly, and then psychic, and then from this psychological perspective, you can kind of start talking about things like mood and atmosphere. It feels feels elevated in some way, and I think everybody's okay to go there. It's like the next step where you sense reverence in its creation, like you sense that like somebody tried to make a gift for God, and that's where it's like, oh, okay. But I think it's the most important. It's the most human description also, like it, like if I were to come back on a trip and say, oh, you should go to San Clemente, it is complex and visually stunning, you'd be like, oh, okay. If I went and said, it's a great vibe, you'd also be like, oh, interesting. But if I told you, hey, you got to go here, it's like evidence somebody tried their darndest to make a gift for God, it is the feeling of reverence, to be within reverence, then you'd be like, oh, yeah, I've got to visit,
Yeah, it's like some of my other experiences is like when I've gone to like a Muslim mosque.
Mhm.
It's something that I can never explain because there's so much negative space within a mosque. It's
Mm.
just like carpet and then these little intricate designs, either from, these, uh, what I love about Islamic culture is they have these nice geometrical patterns,
Mhm.
engraved all on the walls or on the floor of the mosque, or even like they'll have the Arabic from the Quran sort of written across the walls. And I'm just like, and I do think this is a real evidence of putting logos into the creation, where you are sort of
Totally.
writing on the walls and
Yeah.
this like beautiful, um, Arabic way. But I think the way that the West had did it, was, at least when we're looking at Christian culture, they
Mhm.
did it with icons
Yeah.
and statues. But now that was the logos in creation. But now I don't see that as much.
Mhm.
There isn't. You'd have to go to like a history museum, but the history museum isn't. You could say like a gift for God in that sense. So it's a little bit lacking in that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think. Well, I mean, all the mosques that I have been to have been so used. I've gone to a lot of important um, basilicas, cathedrals, and there's just more tourists than worshippers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think ritual it's an important part of making these buildings often, but it's also an important part for like um, maintaining the sanctity of the space. Um, I think I've gone to a monastery
Mm-hmm.
in Quebec, and it's a contemporary build, but just like being there because it's obviously um, it's being actively used in ritual every single day. Like it really feels beautiful. Um, yeah. Whereas, like I went to Notre Dame and it was really, yeah, you didn't, people aren't, it's hard because it's, it's so much different to look at something than to be in it. I think sometimes
Mm-hmm.
and you have to be very, I hope that people in my profession, like who are designers are very aware of that when because, architectural vacationing is pretty popular, like you can want to go and see contemporary buildings, old buildings, and when you get there, you just start looking at it and like checking all the corners, kind of, right? Um, and it's one way to experience it, but it's not like it's not the lens through which it architectures,
Mm-hmm.
um, and sometimes that's okay. Like I guess this is a bit Heideggerian, like looking at a hammer is one thing, but having it as an extension of you, acting as an extension of you, it's a completely different relationship of it. And likewise, like, an environment, you can be looking at it, but it's very different from, in this case, worshiping in it. And in that way, as I did act as a tourist, and I went on a trip to Istanbul and went to loads of mosques. And yeah, it was beautiful to be in them because they were being worshipped in. Um, and I think the mosque architects are really beautiful representations of buildings which hold or make space to or point to mystery. I think like the idea of a mihrab, like and the Qibla wall and the mihrab, for me, I just, it really gets it. I mean, it's a very old form. Like it had time to really get good, and but I think it's still very legible. Whereas with a cathedral, if you don't have people walking through it in the way that it is meant to be, like circulated through, like it's not quite living in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's like if nobody oriented themselves to a Qibla wall, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be a Qibla wall. You know, it wouldn't be living in the way that it wouldn't be functioning, but not in a functioning way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you and I think you know, you kind of alluded to like how we can add mystery, um, when you reference Heidegger about this idea of making it an extension of ourselves. But I think this idea of adding mystery back is going to go back to a process of, you know, and some of like I think one of my favorite articles of yours was when you talked about this idea of creation and then sort of getting rid of the ego of creation, right? Of it being mine, this possessive idea of it being mine.
Mm-hmm.
I do think when we start looking about looking at the consequence of creating out of ego, you can actually feel and see how empty the product really is. The design is empty. It's this void. And what's crazy is that we perpetually surround ourselves with void like things because we can't get rid of the thing that causes the void.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that sense, mystery would almost be impossible. But I think the avenue of like inspiration is that once we start making mystery as an extension of ourselves, like the way the ancients did,
Mm-hmm.
then you know there is kind of like hope, I guess, to kind of make mystery, insert mystery into sort of material again.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, so earlier today, I read your most recent article, and I felt like it had a very interesting analogy parallel in architectural history. This because it's funny because, well, the metaphor you used was hollow, or earlier as you were speaking, but in your article you talk about a split, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, and there's this kind of gap, and actually the gap is the thing, not the sort of the, not the two poles. Um, I think, yeah, I think it's really evident. It's it's evident to an ensouled being that that designs. It's funny because there's design is a game of intentions. You've got a problem, you've got to solve it, you intend to solve it in the best way possible. You use a certain value set to analyze and to operate with, to understand the problem and to create a solution. And today we talk very much in terms of problems and solutions, but you know, whenever you're creating, you've got an intention. Um, and when that intention is really occupied by a certain character, I guess, I'm going to personify intention and give it a character. And when it doesn't have a very strong character, the intention, you notice. And so to go back to your article, it's funny because it's actually like the gap, the split, the void would be like the best source of inspiration, and would make the thing, would hopefully make the thing more more integral than it's funny because we often design with like a really highly defined, strong, entified, definite intention, and then what we get is a void object. But maybe it's, if the process were, let's let's have a mystery like of intention and try and create something that is really well defined. Um, that would work a little better,
Mm-hmm.
and to have an awareness that like our intended intentions, there's going to be so much more that will come through with that. But to bring that, sorry, I'm really rambling, but to bring that back to this, your article earlier, I was thinking about obelisks. Like initially, obelisks were raised in pairs, and they sat at the entryways to Egyptian temples, kind of like in front of the pylons. And so there was two of them, and you passed through the middle. You know, they defined a space, and you proceeded through there. But you know, with, I mean, 2,000 years later, Romans came along and they started taking them, and well, they've eventually left their left their original locations. Like Luxor Temple, it just has one now because the other one is in Place de la Concorde in Paris. And in Paris, it sits at the middle, at the center of a plaza. Like same with like Piazza San Giovanni in Rome. It has a, I mean, St. Peter's Square would be the best example. Like it's this stunning plaza with an obelisk right at the middle. And it's kind of like you were talking, like we've got this ideal, this defined ideal, and we'd be much better if we were able to pull it apart into two and let it be a space rather than to be this super strong fulcrum. Maybe the analogy there between like design intentions being too reduced, I think would be a good way to say it, is a bit iffy, but it just it made me think of that.
That's a really good point. I mean, I didn't even think about that. Like how all of a sudden we like to, center certain objects, um, which is fascinating because it's because it actually kind of makes me think about the pilgrimage that Muslims do with the sacred stone,
Mm-hmm.
right? What I think I find fascinating about the stone is that it's almost like the only way you can negate that centeredness is the fact that they know it's something other than centeredness.
Mm-hmm.
And also the fact that they do this sort of rotational movement around the stone, um, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's, I guess you could say, instead of us moving the objects, right? It's the objects that would move us. And so you using the two statues side by side, it's what allows us to go in the spaces in between, right? If we put the object in the center, well, there's no. I'm actually more confused. I have to pick left or right. There's no boundaries. Um, but to have, like these sort of obelisks and, on the two sides of each other, and force me to go through something. Um, there is something to be said about that, even spiritually. The idea of like I have to go through, um, something. There is no, you say there's no escape. There's no escape in a sense. I have to fully commit myself in this space. Um,
Yeah, I think it takes something that we could think of as an object, an obelisk, and then it takes it away from just an object character towards um, something that is a bit more like narrativized, because it becomes a threshold, which is something that a subject passes through, which is that's a temporal, like it's like a narrative,
mhm.
that it's not just an object, something that you could, draw in CAD and understand, because you, in order to know it, you would need to go through it.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's really good. Um, there's ironically there's this book I've been reading.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's called God is a Verb, which I find kind of, which it for some reason actually perfectly fit in with the way I've been thinking recently. And the way the guy describes God is a verb is that God is not being, right, as like this static thing,
Mm-hmm.
but God is like be hyphen eing. So it's like it shows this sort of process, this becoming, and that we are sustained by this continuous process and becoming. So actually, like basically anything, when I try to pin it down, or even when I try to like describe God, in some ways it's not God, because it's, you would be missing the point, or you'd be trying to pin something down in the midst of its movement,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, right?
You can never pray to the same God twice.
Yeah. I mean, I think was it? I think Heraclitus got it right. Right? You never step in the same river twice, um, which is something beautiful. And I think this static thinking is kind of really hindering us. And
Mm-hmm.
now it makes me think of like, so how do we take something that is seemingly static,
Mm-hmm.
seemingly solid? How do we take something and add it and make it almost have this movement, right? Architecture with movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's either that we as human beings have to sort of provide that movement, like you
Yeah.
kind of alluded to, right? Like you felt that there was something, because as long as there's rituals within the architecture, something was alive.
Mm-hmm.
If not, then it was kind of like dead.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, um, I think a hallmark of contemporary architecture is a sense of flatness. There's
Flatness.
sort of flatness, yeah.
Okay.
Um, like I, so initially I was like, yeah, like I guess we could think of motion in architecture, the seemingly static thing. We could give it a process character by nature of its life cycle. But then as you kept talking, I was thinking, well, actually, like, um, I began to think of Grecian temples, and um, they often they were just in the landscape. Um,
Mhm.
they, you know, I mean, they were in cities and they were in built areas, but sometimes they weren't. Um, and a god was meant to abide there within it. Um, but actually, like the sun moves through it every day. Like the beautiful thing about interiors is that they're not strictly sealed. They're,
Mhm.
we have doors and windows and columns, and and especially like when I'm thinking of like a kind of office tower versus the Grecian temple, like Corinthian columns are like beautifully sculpted, and like the sun sort of like hits all of its spatial I want to say geometries, but it doesn't seem like the right word, but it becomes like a shadow catcher in many ways. And I think like maybe that can go into like the idea of like building not just for the human but also for the world. You know, like does the sun like to come through a window? Does it like the feeling of sort of being separated out of the broad mass of light that comes to us from the sky and gets differentiated through like a trellis? I mean, we love it, it's beautiful, but maybe the light likes it, you know. And I think that's often something we don't pay heed enough to. Often the decision making process is just like the more light the better. But you know, what does the light want?
The more light, the better. Huh. So that means darkness is like not even a thing too much. Interesting. I'm I'm also curious about because you know in mosque they try to position the mosque towards the Qibla, right? They try towards the east. I've always been fascinated by that because it's like counter to our understanding, right? We typically try to position the building where it would probably gain most presence, I guess you could say, most presence. But the mosque tries to gain um, its direction aimed at the presence. It tries to aim its. You could maybe you can say it's trying to aim its intention, like the building itself aims its intention.
Mm-hmm.
This is where everybody's going to pray. This is the direction they're going to pray.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the building, and maybe a regular building, is just sort of like, I guess we're thinking like accessibility. We're thinking, you know, like, is this a building that people are going to get pulled towards to? Um, I don't know. I mean, what's the typical process of that? Because I'm not an architect, so I'm just guessing here.
Well, in terms of siting and orientation in contemporary practices, I think recently with environmental concerns being a big thing, that plays a kind of conventional role. Like you want most of your glazing or your windows on the south part of the building because the sun comes from the south. Also, I mean, where I am is further north, so the change in the sun angle throughout the year gives you shade in the summer and lots of light in the winter. So there's kind of like, there are conventions, there are practical conventions to orientation. Also, I mean, if you're working in an urban context, then you're going to have lots of things to negotiate, like neighboring buildings, setbacks, lot lines, like just like where you can get sun on the site. I mean, if you're next to a 40-story building, then you might just be in the shade all the time. but there's but there's nothing kind of like, there's no sense of like a higher aspiration of alignment that in secular building, you know. Yeah. Whereas again with ancient architecture, it was extremely important. Like each of the winds brought different qualities to a space, so it wasn't just about like about sheltering from the wind, as it often is with climatic concerns in design. Like it was like, what will those winds inspire? Like literally in the space that they breathe through. Yeah, and the idea that you could, well, a lot of modern cities are laid out in a northwest direction, which sort of like understands in a sense that you're on a globe which has poles, you know. And I think that it just kind of comes, I think it's like a leftover from like Roman cities were built. Whenever a Roman city was founded, you started with the Cardo and the Decimanus, which was aligned cardinally, which were the kind of two main streets. And I feel like it's made this way left over, but like you get lots of cities built on the 45, and then you have something like Paris, where it's, you know, it's just like a series of nodes with radial connections through it. Yeah, or I mean, I think in not quite ancient times, but like in the, you know, like Versailles, for instance, it has a huge axis cut in front of the site of the palace, and the idea was that so when you have a long straight avenue, you get perspective, and perspective is all points will meet at infinity. You know, all parallel lines will meet at infinity. So if you have a box, you know, we learned this in school when we were trying to draw. You know, like you create a point, and then you draw all the lines out radially from that, and still that has an idea of like there is an infinity at which these lines are pointed, and when we build in that way, like the long straight axis of Versailles, we're sort of like pointing or indexing infinity, you know. Also Baroque theaters, like what is that town called? I'm never going to remember it, but I'm just thinking of an Italian theater where the theater set is built with a forced perspective, so that you have this sense of a really long space in which the perspective was very evident. And again, it was meant to point to the infinite, right? And even that, you know, it's a way in which you're sighting yourself, or you're like orienting, you're like cultivating a view where something beyond the world is present also.
So it's like, at least from what I'm getting from what you're saying, it was like we do carry this notion from the past of some type of reverence, but it's almost like it's become so mundane and so repeated that it now carries like a disembodied approach to the idea, where now it's just like, you know, when you're talking about infinity and drawing the lines, like I'm not thinking about infinity, I'm just doing it. I'm just it's sort of like this automatic, like this is just how you do architecture, like that's it. You know, there's nothing you say there's nothing more embodied than that. I'm just kind of going through the motions of, you know, what is the probably the current theory of architecture, what is the most efficient building and efficient do you actually, that's a good question. Do you think efficiency is something that hinders, you could say, a creative element to architecture?
Well, there's lots of ways to understand efficiency.
Okay.
And insofar as it often boils down to like labor exploitation, I would say yeah. Just a blanket yeah. But then you think of like thinkers such as like Buckminster Fuller. He designed those geodesic space cubes, like the Biodome in Montreal. And I mean, he was very concerned with efficiency. He was like, how can we get the most rigid form with the least amount of material? And I think that's actually far from stopping beauty in its tracks. I mean, in the same way that something very solid gives us a notion of gravitas, at the same time, something very light and and barely there can give us other notions as well. It's like what is appropriate, right?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I like that. I like that answer actually, because it shows that even the notion of efficiency can still spark creativity, right? Just imposing some type of limit. Like I want this thing to be really efficient. It's almost like he almost adds like an element of reverence for his notion of efficiency.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Um, so kind of, so how would you, for example, because I don't really know anything, right? I don't know anything about architecture, which I think that's why I thought it'd be such a good conversation to have with you. Um, so what could you tell to like a layman about, just the importance of architecture? Like what is it? Um, what is it that makes you care about architecture that might make me care about architecture? Because I don't want it to make it like convince me, but I would rather just add a personal element of like what makes you care about architecture that might make someone turn around and be like, yeah, I never thought about that. That might make me care about it.
I don't know why, but this is coming to mind. But I just think that like beauty loves you, you know?
Mm.
Like, would you forsake your grandmother? Like, like beauty wants to be in this world, and this is one of the ways. And the best, like what I love about architecture, is that you get through architectural beauty, you get to be in it, and for me, that's really special.
Mm.
Architecture's spaces feel like valleys. Valleys hug you, you know,
Mm.
and when you have a beautiful building, you're essentially being embraced in beauty. I mean, if you take beauty seriously, then that should be important for your life.
Mm.
And then that'd be my first point. My second point would be they just there are a lot of stakes. I think there are grave stakes in design. Like we we build cities. When we build cities, we build sort of the instruments of citying. When we build houses, we build the instruments of homing.
Mm.
And you know what I'll borrow an OG Rose example. Like when you sit in a couch defines for you rest, defines relaxation.
Mm.
And I think couches do a great job of that, but there's other ways in which other objects or structures in our lives, they define our lives in ways that aren't so nice.
Mm.
And to be critical of that, but also celebratory of that, um, it's just it's a responsibility, right? Because we're making these things.
Okay. Yeah, I mean the beauty point. I think you would add anybody there. I mean, you had me there. And even like from a theological point of view, right? Beauty, well, like in Islam, beauty is like a name of God, a face of God. So the idea that you aim towards beauty is like to choose to be in a certain face or presence of God, which I love the way Islam tries to describe that. So yeah, the other question would be this idea of, so who's a thinker right now that is sort of influencing you in terms of like architecture? Who do you think like is somebody that you think can possibly change the landscape about the way we do architecture? Who's pushing that line for you, or if there is anybody pushing that line for you?
As a designer or just a thinker in general?
I'll take it either way.
Um, well, I mean, I feel like I should. The first thing that came to mind was Sloterdijk, Peter Sloterdijk, and I think he's already doing that. Actually, he holds a position at a design university, which for philosophers, I think is pretty odd. And yeah, I mean, I reference his work a lot in my writing. Reading it for me, through the process of reading his work, I really just felt like, oh, things which are confusing are much less confusing now. And I think he really has, I mean, his tome, Spheres, I mean, he's specifically said, read this as like the follow-up to Being in Time, but like think of it as space and time. And if I could put that book into every architect's hand, I would. Might take them 8 months to read, but it's okay.
So Sloterdijk, okay. I've heard of the name before, but okay. Being in Time, like space and time. I like that.
Oh, sorry, Space and Being.
Space and Being? Okay. Space and Being. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Space and Being. Okay. Yeah. Gosh.
I think I would also shout out my my thesis advisor, Alberto Perez Gomez. I think he's really got. He is just like a walking encyclopedia of architectural history. Like, it was a pleasure to study under him, and like I felt like the whole time I was in school, I was just like trying desperately to grasp all of the knowledge that was coming out of him, like, and like hide it for later when I was smarter and could understand. But he has a really great understanding of like kind of the importance of atmosphere to public life that I think is really unique.
There's a book coming to mind, actually, now that I think about it. I think OG Rose did a talk on it. I think it was something about art. Of course, it's a very horrible way to phrase it because there's lots of things they talk about with art, but it has to do with a book that essentially talks about how throughout the course of art history, it reflects the sort of the psyche of the current times. Right? When we start like talking about Picasso and the Cubism, it starts reflecting a certain approach. And I'm curious. I mean, I'm pretty sure this is true, but I'm wondering if this would be a stretch, and probably it would be a stretch for you. I'm curious if the way you look at architecture now, if you were to sort of, does it reflect some type of like psychological position, right? It could be like a little bit neurotic, psychotic. Do certain buildings reflect these psychological pathologies? Is that something that have you thought about?
Yeah. Hate to trash anybody, but I I really find Daniel Libeskine's. I don't know if I could. I would need some time before I turn this into like a coherent, solid thesis. But Daniel Libeskine's. I don't know if do you know that name? He
No,
did like
I don't know that name at all.
the addition to the Denver Art Museum. He did the ROM extension in Toronto, and they're like these crystalline forms. He's actually like an amazing artist. Like when he creates the imagery prior to building the buildings, they're stunning. You're like, wow, these are like Lothlorien crystals that you can inhabit. But then they get built and they just look like, to me, like voodoo dolls for paranoia.
Wow.
I don't know. They're so sharp and they're not crystalline at all. They're very opaque. And just the angles, they loom over you in such a manner that you kind of, it's like, if you're paranoid and you're thinking like things are constantly like hostile and sinister, they're a bit hostile and sinister.
That's interesting. Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's great. I mean, I like how you went from, the concept to the actual product, and yet somehow it reflects some type of, some paranoia,
Yeah.
and how it follows you. It doesn't actually. There is no dwelling. It's a sort of like hostile environment. So that's fascinating to me, the way it can reflect like that.
Yeah, and actually, like, I think this might relate to our earlier discussion because there's this intention that is really evidently it's communicated as very positive, but it really has like like a silver lining and a dark side. Yeah.
That's really that's really fascinating, because now it makes me think. I'm already imagining like a title, psychoanalysis and architecture. What does the unconscious have to do with architecture at all? And I think there is something to be said, the way at least you were describing, that even if somebody has this sort of conscious intention, that in the very designing of the architecture, there's this unconscious impression sort of made manifest in the building. And that could either reflect the designer's kind of idea, or that reflects the epoch of our time. I mean, I think there's many rooms for interpretations there, but it is kind of interesting the way we can't look at architecture as detached from ourselves and the way we design. And I think maybe that's even the first step of like acknowledging that. you know. I think we.
Hi.
Yeah. Hi. So did I cut out or did you cut out?
Well, I didn't hear anything after. Maybe that's the first
thing. Oh, that was all I said.
That's all. Yeah.
I said maybe that's like the first thing that we should do in the process. Trying to kind of understand the dialect between creating and making, or being the creators and creating.
Yeah. Claude Silvestri, he's an Italian architect, and famously he designed Kanye West and Kim Kardashian's house. It is stunning. he, I just find this so funny. I don't even know what to make of it. Sometimes you just think like the world is so full of like existential puns, but he really believes that he writes a bit and believes that um, contemporary architecture is very much is a reflection of public of collective Western narcissism, and he believes that like starchitectural buildings, as they're fondly called, are just like giant mirrors where we aim to see ourselves. And he really takes he's a religious man, and he finds it tragic that sacred spaces are no longer made for God. He feels they're no longer aligned to stars or to the world or to God. They're really just houses for man, which, I mean, that's idolatry, building idols. But anyways, he built this house for Kim Kardashian, which is really funny because she's like the queen of the selfie, which is like the symbol of narcissism. It's funny. I don't know.
So maybe the architecture can't say too much about the people necessarily living in it, but it can sort of reflect the designer's intention, unconscious, maybe unconscious intention.
Yeah. So one of his, I know, like in general, his design intention is to create spatial silence so that you have room for contemplation. And his spaces are very iconoclastic, like beautiful materials, but often very white. And I mean, if you're familiar with Kim Kardashian's house, it's totally minimalist. And I think it's kind of funny because in his conception of what he's going to do with this house wherein this family lives, is to create all this space and silence for contemplation of God. But I think how it's used actually is really kind of like the white void, the photography white void. It just becomes like an excellent backdrop for like racks of skimsware. I don't know how this got here, but it's got here.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great that we're going here. But I do love that idea in general about how he's trying to choose to make space for, like, he's inserting space for contemplative silence, which is something that I don't even think that we could do naturally without it. Like the building really does play a role in my my silence.
Yeah.
Like it isn't just like me trying to willfully do this contemplative silence. It's the idea that I have to find a space for that. And if there isn't a space for that, then how am I going to do it? And like you had said earlier, right? There used to be some type of boundary between the city and the outside. Now it's just splashed everywhere. So it's like, where do I ever find a space of this silence? Of this like idleness that is so beneficial to our thinking and just sort of like, I think honestly, I would say if I were to give one real critique, I think that is like my real critique of like modernity is like, there is no, everything is just sort of just in this bustle of reaction and engagement. Everything is meant and positioned for your engagement. There is never anything to like embrace what Buddhism and Hinduism would call this non-attachment. There's no room for non-attachment.
Yeah, totally. And often designers are brought in order to create more spectacle rather than reduce it. Like especially after Frank Gehry built Bilbao, the term the Bilbao effect was created, which it's this it's, I don't know if you know the Bilbao Museum, but it's like formally it's like a sculpture. It's like it's it's shiny. It's a big, shiny, curvy sculpture, and it's very spectacular. And when it was built, everybody just wanted to go see it because it's a big spectacle. I actually don't know it well enough to critique it, other than at this level of at this kind of coarse grain level. But after that, a lot of people wanted to replicate this Bilbao effect. So if you built spectacular buildings in places that wanted tourists, you would get them. And yeah, there's no, you're like, you're intentionally disrupting silence, you know, and often in places that are so refined, like old cities, which are so attuned to their environments, and they just get kind of like yelled in.
Yeah, no, I agree. This idea of disrupting silence. So it really, I mean, I don't want to reduce it to a dichotomy, but it just seemed like there's this prominent theme of like, do we make it a spectacle rather than this sort of indwelling silence?
Yeah, I think at this moment we have so much spectacle that it really feels like a duality. You know, there could be a more balanced measure of each, but at the moment we have like Times Squares as cities centers.
I'm wondering, like, even when we talk about, like, for example, ADHD, I'm wondering if that's more a consequence of our spectacle building, you know, the way we sort of, you know, it'd be curious to think if that would be something of that nature, where there's just so much going on, so much stimuli to attract ourselves to, um, that it actually would leave us as human beings, one, riddled with anxiety, ADHD, possibly depression. Because I think what the spectacle would also allow is that certain people would understand the vanity of all those things, right? That they turn out to be just empty. And that when they confront the silence for the first time, it's like pure horror. You know, and I think that's a real problem. Actually, confronting
Yeah,
silence for the first time must be horrifying.
yeah. I mean, baby steps. But this is where I think I'm interested in design just more broadly, right? Because of course, like I think it is our spaces. You know, like we have we have like illness of attention, you know, en masse, and like I think it's hard to say it's just our spatial environments, or it's just our cell phones, or it's just our communication systems. Like it's, I guess that's cell phones, but or it's just social media. Like we are designers of all these things, and they all seem to be imbued with a an avoidance of silence.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Even the more that we push, like, let's say, like virtual, technology and stuff, it's like now there's even like a subspace to like continually avoid that silence. Like we've created a whole other space of virtual reality where not only am I already riddled with spectacles, but now if there's any downtime of that sort, I can just enter myself in a realm where there's like infinite uh, spectacles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think like actually I have a lot of hope in virtual space.
Okay, I'm interested in this.
Uh, like earlier when I talked about going to San Clemente and feeling like every piece of marble in the floor was so cared for. You know, I mean, the craftsmanship is real, and we no longer have those traditions of craft anymore. Like we just don't. You know, there's always like one office in every major city that does like, well, in North America because we don't have much to restore, but who does restorative work, and and there are old buildings that need maintenance. So somebody needs to know the old practices. But when these buildings get updated, they're often subject to like coming up to code, and so that means you know where it's appropriate, vapor membranes need to be added, or you know elevators, different like different dimensions of different spaces for accessibility. Anyways, the practice of building, it's a much different craft, and that's in construction. A lot of care uh, is 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 just diverted to efficiency in a way that has no poetics, unlike Buckminster. Um, but what I'm finding is that like when I was a kid, I loved video games. Me and my brother played video games together, and it was an amazing experience. We would stay up way past our bedtime and play Fable and hope mom didn't hear us, you know? And like I remember being inside of Fable and looking at I don't know if you're familiar, but there's like Knot Hole Glade. It had these buildings in the video game that were carved, and so you know the representations of a fictional building, but they've been attended to in quite a lot of detail. And so like artists would have sat there and they would have described this fiction in a way which it's a kind of craft, you know, like. And I mean, you know, maybe not all the metaverses may get that kind of love and attention, but I really felt that video game did. And I think because we always hate new things, and I think it's good to just like make sure we're being critical for good reasons, and it's not just because it's throwing us off balance, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that virtual space needs to be imbued with spectacle. It is a lot of the time, but it could be, I think, in the way that architecture could be also and has been. You know, it could it could house a lot of things that we just don't know yet.
I mean, you already talked about my weakness. I mean, I did play Fable. I did play Fable, so I know
Yeah.
what it's about. I think Fable 3 was it was funny for me because then I had to be king finally, and I was like, oh no, I don't want this responsibility anymore. These people are driving me crazy. Um, and
That's so
it,
funny.
and the game, when you're king, proposed such hard decisions that it was like, okay, either if I do this for somebody and it's good, but then somehow in the end, like I'm a bad king. Like I don't understand. Um, but anyways, I love the challenge of it. So I think there is something to that.
But see, like you're totally, it's a world you're
Yeah.
drawn with in it. It was like, I mean, an aesthetic experience is an aesthetic experience, I guess, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we shouldn't just prefer brick and mortar aesthetic experiences.
Well,
But
yeah, I'd be interested how let's say like a virtual contemplative silent space would be like.
yeah,
And I think that might even be the solution to counteract the the way you had proposed the way cities are now, right? Everything is overflowing, the spectacles.
mhm,
Virtual reality can be that counter where you could sort of transport that contemplative space via technology.
mhm.
So
Yeah,
I think it would be an interesting way to do that.
I think you got to use the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
I think with video games, for me personally, just in my experience of video games, moving through virtual space is much more important than just, it's essentially just an image, except for that it is in motion in response to your interaction, right? And I could see something like a virtual, you know, labyrinth.
Mm,
Like those. It looks like a tree. Those old Christian. They're labyrinths, right? Am I saying?
I think
Yeah.
so.
And you would walk meditatively through that. I could see something like virtual reality. Maybe you put on an Oculus and you go through a walk through an environment. I think would probably be a lot more effective if we're trying to imagine how virtual realities could give us space for silence. Instead of just like a representation of a meditation room,
Hmm.
um, and just sitting there with an Oculus on, it's like you're already in the meditation room. I think one of the advantages of virtual space is that it's very energy costly in physical space to move through it,
Mm.
but like in virtual space, you don't have the energy requirements. So like if you want, you can go inside a simulator and be like Top Gun without burning all that fuel. Um, so yeah, I just I think there's potential, and there's so many things we haven't thought of. So that's
Mm.
that's the good news.
Yeah. No, that's a good idea. Like sort of walking spaces that are virtual that would be contemplative silence.
Yeah,
Um, even the idea of like mimicking like a monastery, walking through it, or like walking through some type of like past spaces that were contemplative, uh, and that had that silence. Yeah, I think that that is one possible way. Um, I guess I guess it does matter in the end whether we make things as a means or as an end in itself.
totally.
Yeah, and I think architecture, when it was used as a means rather than as an end, and I think being a spectacle is making it as an end.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we fall kind of short of things. And to even be critical of religion too, in my sort of studies of it, the problem with like the rituals, and if you read a lot of like spiritual literature from like the saints and mystics, um, what's funny about like practicing certain rituals is that you'd have to understand either the teacher makes you eventually give up that practice to kind of like help you with this non-attachment to the practice, or you kind of have to keep in mind that this thing that you do to sort of become saved is not the thing that's going to save you.
Mm-hmm.
It's always a means, right? And I think this is where even we start talking about like virtue ethics and stuff, where people think that if I just kind of behave good, then I deserve this salvation. But that's actually not the case.
Mm-hmm.
That there is this aspect in like the mystical and saintly realm where good itself is not, it's not an end in itself, it's a means. Like God himself, like having a relationship with God is like the ultimate fascination. There is no fascination or ego fascination with, heaven or hell, or, I did so many good things, so therefore I deserve salvation. It's nothing like that. It's their sole fascination is having this relationship with the other.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
so.
Hmm. I'm trying to think through this. My most consistent spiritual practice at the moment um, is on Sundays. I meet with a group and we pray the rosary.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm trying to think about like what that has done as a ritual to me. It's
Mm.
funny because I never really thought of it in that way. Like I think, like what I think I'm doing when I'm praying the rosary is offering to the moment in which I'm doing it, a
Mm-hmm.
rose garden, like Our Lady. Like I'm giving the world her presence a little more, which it could certainly use.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, it's like, is there a way in which like actually just giving that up would really help me? I don't know.
So to kind of like elaborate, Saint John of the Cross, he wrote this book called, I think, Dark Soul of the Night or something like that. And with every kind of like spiritual approach, there is a point in which you reach your spiritual capacity with that act. And what the funny example that St. John of the Cross did was that he actually made one of the monks give up praying the rosary because he had built an attachment to that rosary via reaching, the divine.
Mm-hmm.
And once he took that away, the guy had to sort of find a reapproach of doing, approaching the divine. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess you could say this, like, if you have that approach already, or that maybe comfortable approach to, inserting Mary through the rosary, right? The task would be, how do you continue to do that without the rosary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Without that attachment of the practice, right? What other practice could you do to sort of build that up? In essence, it is just solely to maintain this fluidity within our spiritual development. um, and I can't honestly tell you that you are at the peak of it to where you should throw the practice away. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying that at all.
I'm
I'm just
probably not there yet.
yeah, I'm just saying it's possible that our, depending on our spiritual capacity, it's possible that maybe I get only stuck, like maybe my highest level is just that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea, but I think there's room for that fluidity and practice and movement. And there, what I love about the Catholic Church, when you start reading some of their spiritual books, is that prayer sort of develops over time, where eventually prayer, you're not supposed to say anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like the whole goal is like this. The highest point of prayer is like saying nothing, and that is like your contemplative praying. But as novices, we have to sort of begin with words and like say things and, say personal things to God. But at
Mm-hmm.
the end of the day, like the ultimate aspect is saying nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think even in Buddhism and Hinduism, they have this sort of uh, spiritual. Actually, I think Buddhism has this wonderful depiction in art of the progress of your meditative mind and every obstacle that you encounter as you sort of progress through your periods of silence. And I think it's exactly like that. There is always something that we're encountering that sort of wants to hinder our progress in that way. Um, but yeah, that's that's my spew on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know why, but in this like kind of within the idea that like to like the highest prayers to say nothing, and we've been talking for a while about silence, spatial silence, but also literal silence, and and then I think that relates really well to like our like human concept of space.
Mm-hmm.
We do lots of things to like articulate space, but the idea is that it's empty.
Mm-hmm.
But then, I mean, I guess what we're saying through our dialogue is that actually like in the space between the two obelisks, in the split between the manifest self and the ideal self, like there's always these gaps, and it's like the empty thing is the fullest thing.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, I'm kind of thinking of like the equation for gravity. It's like G is equal to M over delta D squared. So like gravity is equal to mass over change in distance squared. And like, I mean, when you have the delta D squared as as dividing the mass, you never have a zero G, right? Like predominantly we feel the gravitational pull of the Earth, but the Earth feels the gravitational pull of the sun and also all the planets, and the sun itself is held in the gravitational pull of whatever is at the center of the universe. And like right now, the gravitational forces acting on me are not just the Earth alone. Like it's like everything to some extent, no matter how small or large. Like you're held in this space, in this place by like everything. And I think that's kind of it's that kind of like maybe it's like where the value of the emptiness and the silence
Mm.
kind of comes from.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny because I was just the God is Verb book is like a Jewish mysticism book,
Mm.
and it traced through this idea of like there's thought, and then there's thoughtlessness, which is sort of like emptiness, but then there's like this beyond nothingness or beyond emptiness, which what they call it's a Hebrew word, but basically it translates into endlessness. And it's almost like there's this negative one. I think I've heard somebody call it like there's this negative one, which I can only ever think of like love in this dialectical fashion,
Mm.
um, as this like it's funny because I do think when we talk about love, we automatically think about this idea of endlessness.
Yeah.
Um, and it's funny to me because we don't even have to be theological about it. It's just that we already associate love with something that is so profoundly like beyond our imagination, beyond words, beyond infinity, sort of speaking. Um, but but I think when we actually look at love, like kind of like objectively, is that it teaches you even when you get attached to a form, it does this funny thing where it says that's not it.
Mm.
Right? It keeps you in this cycle of birth and death that you realize not even you don't possess love. Nobody possesses love. And
Mm-hmm.
I think before I started doing my work on like theology, I was fascinated with incorporating philosophy and dating a lot,
Mm.
because what I found funny about dating was there's this funny interaction where we're in this negative state of desire where it's like, okay, I want you, you want me, we're both lacking. But
Mm-hmm.
isn't it funny that in this midst of us both lacking, how is it that it becomes something that we, feel like fulfilled by, so full, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we were we never had it in the beginning, but then all of a sudden when you interact with two lacks, it's almost like actually love itself is not has to remain not our own in order for us to be fulfilling. Like we end up being the very negative spaces or the vessels for love itself that sort of allows love to be possible at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, like we're acting as windows much more than objects.
yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. There is this famous like mystical saying about like we are like mankind is these sort of mirrors in reality where all we do is reflect the divine. But the problem is that in order to reflect the divine, we have to go through the process of like purifying, cleaning the mirror in order to properly reflect the divine. Um, so I do think, there is so much to say about reflection in architecture, reflection in the way we perceive things, and the phenomena of the fact that we have different personalities and everything we do sort of reflects those personalities that we have. But I guess there is my current work actually is this idea of like spiritual temperaments, where we kind of are given these spiritual temperaments that sort of reflect our spiritual capacities and our spiritual yearnings towards maybe certain religions and so on. But
Yeah,
yeah.
like somebody who's more kind of self-assertive or action-oriented might have a different like access to an aspect of the divine than somebody um, more receptive
Mhm.
or listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know like the Hindu paths, for example? Like,
Yeah.
so this is really interesting. So the Hindu paths to God are, one is through devotion, you could say through love. The other path is through
Mm.
works, through doing deeds, charity, and then the other path is through knowledge. Now, in the Catholic Church, they reduce the temperaments to two, but it's basically, are you a Martha or are you a Mary? Martha was the woman in the Bible that was sort of cooking and preparing the food for Jesus. And then Mary's like the one just sort of stuck at Jesus' feet and completely immersed in contemplation of Jesus. So it already shows that there's this aspect of like spiritual temperaments that we have, and how we that really our being is already our obstacle and pathway to the divine itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's the paradox. We are we are the obstacle and the path to the divine. And that's how I kind of look at it now. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah, it's kind of like love languages. It's
Yeah.
related to the dating thing. You know, some person is an act of service lover, other people are a praise and word lover. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think 2 hours is probably a long time for people. But I really enjoyed this conversation that we had.
Yeah, it's great.
Because I, like, again, I don't know anything about architecture, but I think it really shed some like light on, some of the problems, some of the critiques you see. Um, I guess what is, because I know you're going through indie thinkers, which I'm on there, but I'm not like active through indie thinkers. I
Mm-hmm.
think somebody told me one time, like, you're like this dude in this space by himself, just doing his own thing.
Yeah.
think somebody told me that one time. I think it's pretty accurate. But yeah, I guess with indie thinkers, I mean, okay, so here's a good question.
Mhm.
Did you ever feel this yearning to? I mean, I guess it would be kind of answered, but I guess you did feel like some type of yearning to like reach out to community, have interactions with people that sort of, maybe think in various ways and have conversations and such. Like, what led you to that point? Like, was that ever lacking in your reality, or like what?
Well, I guess, yeah, to do with, there's two words in the name of the cohort, indie and thinker. In terms of indie, I think that like when I was in school, I really got the impression in my post grad, like I do not want the things that they want me to want. I, I don't value the things that this institution values. It's really hard to act as to participate in the institution when I just don't want what it wants, and I don't want to frame things in the metaphysics that it wants me to frame things. Like it's extremely hard to sit there and ask your professor, does the light enjoy moving through the space? Like it doesn't. Let's not ask. So that's the indie part, and what I like about the community, but also just what I think is like just more of a trend of independent thinkers. Way just completely, of which indie thinkers is sort of couched within that culture, which is better. Um, it's it's good because what I like about it is that you have to meet people where they are actually at, what they actually think, and a lot of people think different things, and I think the freedom outside of an institution that you have to simply think what you think, it's really valuable and generative. And then the second sort of, yeah, so that really leads us to the second word, which is thinking. And it's like, I guess it's, earlier we talked about there's something under all of the fumbling and that unifies our thinking. And thought is sort of a weird thing, right? Like some days you're just like there in the bathtub and you're like writing a manifesto or something, like it comes to us. And it, is it ever really connected? Like one day I'm like obsessed with the Red Book, and then I move on to like another text, like, and I'm like, what is it in both of these that I feel like really, really gets at like my personal curiosity about wherever we are right now, right? Like, I won't know unless I start thinking, and often by like talking to others and seeing what they think, like that's really the best way, right? Of thinking, of processing thoughts, right? And that's been really valuable. Like it's nice talking, well, to Daniel, to yourself online. Like it's really great that we have the opportunity to correspond in the ways we do, and just to hear your takes, because it's like it fertilizes my own thinking, and I hope it does the same for you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's funny. You did bring up like one thing that I've always been curious about. Like, why is it that I'll pick up a book and then all of a sudden I'll just drop it, and then all of a sudden, like I'm reading this one book now. Like, and I've already mentioned it a couple times. God is a verb, and I just can't stop reading it. I'm just like so immersed in it, and it's just so dang interesting. Because sometimes I feel like in my intellectual thinking, I'm like, okay, this is the book that I need to read to sort of progress my theory, my intellectual thinking, right? But then I start realizing that that's not how it works. That's just not how it works. It's actually like the books themselves demand to you, like, no, this is actually what you need. This is what
Mhm.
you need to think. Um, and I guess that's why, like, I don't, I'm like careful about, I guess, jotting my like theories or whatever too quickly, because what I end up finding is that I'll write my theories down and I feel something so, I guess, disembodied about it that I just sort of lose interest. And they might be perfectly fine and provocative ideas, but it's, and I guess this seems to be like a common theme when I've heard, some people like give me some feedback, is that my writing is best when, not when I'm being super logical or, thinking, but it's like when I sort of combine the two, when I combine my experience and my thinking. People find that sort of fascinating. And people love that. Um, and so, my own struggles with my thinking and my sort of, I'm constantly always I'm always battling the notion of being in the world and not being in the world.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so yeah, that's wonderful. I think just to kind of end it, I did have one question from your writing,
Mhm.
which was your concept of anti-world
Mhm.
or like unworlding.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about, so how does this notion of anti-worlding that you used in correspondence to like the world,
Mhm.
if we're thinking in movement, how does that, like, where are you in that function, in that movement between anti-world and worlding and so on?
Mhm.
If I'm even addressing that correctly.
Yeah. Well, I think this is an idea that I've used to disrupt the earlier too simple dichotomy of architecture as order from chaos. Like the natural world is very orderly, and architecture is too, but in a different order. But I think actually, and I think anti-world is a form of order. Actually, I mean, a great book is James Gleick's Chaos, because like chaos can be mathematically defined, which is really interesting. But anyways, so you could say chaos is an order as well. But with anti-world specifically, like for me, I started reading recently Byung-Chul Han
Oh.
of The Expulsion of the Other. And what I'm seeing is that we have space. The term space is very linked to an idea of res extensa, which
Mhm.
it's dicey, so bear with me. Like, I think we have space, we have an earth on which we can carve out spaces, interiors, against an exterior, and you can carve out a world, you can carve out an anti-world. I see an anti-world metaphorically characterized as something very sealed, and I think an anti-world is I think we've started building them. I think an anti-world is narcissistic, and I think it cannot include pain, discomfort, or death. Um,
Mm.
I think it wants to seal itself against the outside and pretend that the outside does not exist. It wants to expel the otherness, the wilderness. And I think it's an architectural project, but it's also an epistemological project. It wants to be very tight, and I think that we're like frogs. You know, when you put a frog in a bucket and it dies,
Mhm.
we need ponds. You know, like the bucket is, it's a weird feedback loop. I wouldn't say it's causal, but
Mhm.
I think, and Sloterdijk himself has an idea of the immune system of an individual also living within a collective immune system that's built of ideas. And for a while, a part of that collective immune system was the fact that the earth was the center of the world. And it became very difficult to cope with the fact that the sun was the center of the world and it revolved itself around a universe. So yeah, I think anti-worlding, it's an option. I don't think it's a great option. I don't think it's like everything in the right measure. Like a spectacle can be important in the right place. And I think this kind of sealedness and dryness, I think narcissism and the expulsion of death, it may have its place in life, but, you know, we could die in there too.
Yeah.
That's a metaphor, but also not really.
I do think you're, I've actually been fascinated. I've been fascinated by the implications of the way the ancient world used to kind of view the world.
Mm-hmm.
And you had said like, the earth was at the center and now it's the sun at the center. It's funny because I think once we started associating this real materialistic notion of the world, that the symbolic thinking of the world being at the center, I really do believe that had some real consequences to sort of denying that symbolic notion. Because it's funny because, now we're so ingrained with the materialistic thinking that we can't even fathom the idea of the symbolic world, that the ancients weren't thinking in materialistic notions, that they were thinking more symbolically.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, what I really loved about Carl Jung and Hillman. You mentioned him too. I think even Jonathan Padeau, he's really into like symbolic world, and he's an Orthodox Christian. Always, that's like my language, symbolic thinking, symbolic anything. I think once we start talking like neuroscience and cognitive stuff, it's not that I'm against it, but it's just a language that I'm just not. It just feels like such disembodied language to me that I just, it almost gets me on the verge of like pure disgust, almost. And it's just a preference of my own. I mean, I totally see the validity and its necessity and so on of that research. But yeah, I think you really pointed at something of that nature. And the anti-world kind of reminds me of like Nietzsche's Last Man, where it's like the last man has taken over so much that he has cultivated himself in the process of cultivating himself an anti-world, a world that reflects the last man, which is the anti-world. Yeah, that was beautiful. Yeah, the notion of anti-world. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. So I'll just, if you have any last comments, you can share them, and then we'll cater off.
No, I thank you for inviting me on. This was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. It's nice to be able to talk in person.
Yeah, same. All right. So, all right. Thank you guys for watching.